So I think it's probably prudent for us to get going on the final leg of the marathon. And I know a number of you have flights which are leaving, or which would require you to leave slightly before the scheduled ending time for the event today. However, Fotis and I talked about this, and we're thinking that we may be able to sort of slightly compress and invigorate the event today, so that instead of having the sort of we have to make it till 5:30 feeling, we would have the kind of sprinting feeling. So what we're going to do this morning is, depending on how the discussion goes and so forth, we're thinking perhaps we only really need a half an hour for the opening conversation, in which we would like to talk a little bit about sort of the agenda for further work. In other words, where does this get us? What have we achieved so far, and what remains to be done? Obviously, the answer is a whole lot. But in concrete terms, if we were going to write, for example, a grant proposal for another larger event or something like that, what would be the key topics that would belong in the agenda for that event? So if we could sort of spend a little bit of time talking about that, that would be great. And then that might enable us to move lunch up a little bit, and then there might also turn out to be ways, depending on how things are going, that we can compress a little bit in the afternoon. So anyway, in that spirit, is there anything you'd like to add to my random thoughts about housekeeping? Okay, in that case, I think what we'll do is Fotis will lead the discussion on this agenda for further work thing, and I'm going to take dynamic notes in this Google Doc. If you also want to take notes in the Google Doc, there is the URL. It's just a kind of sketchpad place where we can put stuff. So feel free to put anything you like in there. And in the meantime, I will sit down so I can type.
I could use the computer, but
I'm sorry, because you can't see the
So the basic idea is that we wanted to talk with you about this new set of ideas. We think these are what we try to come up with are topics which we think are obviously cluster of ideas or problems which are specific to the topic we are discussing here and discussing in the last 2 days. So if you would kind of write a book about this, or kind of like try to substructure a longer conference on this, you would use, or you could use these as aspects which have to be treated. So don't treat it as a hierarchy or whatever. It's just a loose set of ideas, but you would like to have your input. The first actually is, are there more? But do you see things on this list? Sorry, do you see not things? Are there things absent which should be there? And knowing this is a bit difficult to see what's not there. Please, as soon as some idea pops in your head during the coming discussion, please let us know.
Identification issues.
Identification issues. Okay. Identification issues. Can you describe exactly what you're talking about?
Just think of building triples with URIs, and then you have to decide some identification you use. And I think there's some need of, well, maybe global identification tools. And I think we should discuss this in the context of RAF maybe.
So identification of specific objects, persons, and so on. Yeah. So this comes together with the talk of Stefan and others. And so how to identify? I mean, there are some practical issues here, but a lot of practical issues. I went up with Daniel today, and he explained some of these issues. But are there also conceptual problems to be solved? Yeah.
So, closely related to identification, of course, we have granularity issues. On what level of granularity we actually try to model.
Yeah.
It's closely related to what do we identify.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's, because
basically an extension in the same direction. What's the relation between a priori models and ex post? So how does the model emerge from the data by itself, and how do you predefine it? Because obviously you cannot start with blank slate. Right? And that's a very important kind of thing, because it takes you to this kind of thing. If there is something like a gradient between, say, schema or model and instances, there's something in between, and that's very, very undefined.
So this would be the whole topic actually of how do I create a model and refine it, and it would touch with the whole thing of assessment and validation too. So because the responsible validation could mean I have to refine my model and sit.
So I think you already have this in your minds under defining data modeling, but I think it might be useful to be a little more explicit. We've kind of danced around the issue here, but when we talk about data modeling, are we talking about using data to model things in the real world, or are we talking about the models we use to use data to model things in the real world?
Could you repeat the second part?
Are we talking about using data to model things in the real world, like creating surrogates of real things using data of some sort?
Yeah.
Or are we talking about the models we use to generate data surrogates of real world things that we call models?
Okay.
I think I'm picking up on that, but also on Max's. One of the questions I think we need to pose is the adequacy of the models, because I believe that one of the things that's important is when we discover that the tools we're using are not actually adequate to the task that we've set ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that presents us with certain problems. Do we devise workarounds? Do we try to formalize solutions? Do we compromise our goals? Do we actually look again at the underlying models and see that they should be extended or set aside in favor of something else? Right? There's, several good questions there, which I think most humanities projects face.
Yeah. So we're talking about a process model of data modeling, where you have at some point to validate and assess how good your model is, and then you take further steps.
Right, but you see this happens at more than one level, right? Because Sid is identifying, reminding us that we have models and then we have tools and methods and technologies that we build models out of, which are themselves models at a lower level. The relation there, for example, the XML tree versus the TI system of labels over and nodes or elements in the tree.
Yeah.
And that inadequacy can be in either place.
Yeah. I think there is the distinction used to say we have data models, meta models, and meta models. That would be the instance of a text encoded in TI. TI as a schema, and XML as a schema language, and a way to instantiate the whole thing.
Well, right, but you can also look at the stack the other way. I mean,
yeah, sure.
the direction, because the thing is that you talk about the XML as being a meta model because it's describing the thing that describes the thing you're describing. But that, the only reason you need to describe something is because it's actually lower down, because everything is built on top of that.
Just the way to distinguish between these. So I'm sorry I lost track of now. Elena was.
I think the point to discuss is the tension between customization and standardization.
Okay.
Because the models, we talk about the importance to like shared models, but we also talk how particular and fantastic is our text that is completely different from anybody else's. And this is a big tension that is at the base of the problems of building tools and having really interchange. So I do think it's crucial. The TI has a solution for that, but is that working? I'm not sure it is.
Yeah.
And that's that this problem with building tool for the digital humanities, which I found that is something almost impossible because of the extension.
Yeah.
Because the two tension, the extremes are really taking some.
I really feel it.
And I would jump on this because it relates to the point I wanted to make concerning the process of defining a model. What is the toolbox we've got at hand? It relates to customization. And this toolbox has to be agnostic with regard to TI, what have you, background you have, because how do you model a person, the characteristics of a person? We've seen things in EAD, we've got things in TI, we've seen things related to the European model. Same for bibliographic data, how do we model that? We discussed the issue of a corpus, how do we model this corpus? And we need to be able to, from the point of view of training, but also from the point of view of our community, to share those basic components and say, look, if you're in this framework and you want to model a person, start with this or this, and you'll be compatible with what other people are doing. So the Lego brick again, sorry, when you've been made me have nightmares seeing Lego bricks falling on me.
I think the two main metaphors for this conference, Lego and food. So, fine.
I would just pick up too again on really emphasizing what a couple other people have brought up, which is the creation or the design of models and their accuracy or their usefulness. Something I mentioned on day one was that in certain branches of information science, you approach the design of almost anything, whether it's a new tool, a new interface, a new ontology, whatever, by first creating an experimental design where you're actually studying the community you're trying to serve in a very systematic fashion, whether you're applying, in terms of data collection, analysis, the modes of analysis, whether you're applying grounded theory or whatever. And so thinking about different approaches to design, and then also we really concentrated on data modeling, but of course the initial title of the conference was Knowledge Organization and Data Modeling. So it's interesting that knowledge organization has largely been absent, but I'm also thinking from the design or the creation perspective in classification systems, you often see a kind of, from a diachronic perspective, I think this touches on some of the presentations from yesterday, that the systems themselves develop in a kind of very ad hoc, almost sedimentary fashion over time. So the two main kinds of classification systems you have are faceted and hierarchical. Mm-hmm. And something like the Dewey Decimal System has gone through 22 different editions. It started out as a hierarchical system, but it's become increasingly, it's the inverse, a faceted system over time. The inventor claims to have been sitting listening to a church sermon when he had his eureka moment for what the Dewey Decimal System should be like. So the way in which, thinking about that diachronic dimension, that we don't simply scrap things and start over when we start to see their flaws, but rather we use this sort of accretion process. We build on what we've already done and what that means for the model.
Yeah, it ties in with what Julie was talking about.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd like to take up again what Sid was saying. He was mentioning real world versus models. You could also see that in nature versus artifact. My question would be regarding defining data modeling, whether there is a real world accessible to us without modeling. Yeah, maybe there is just modeling, and there is messy, diffuse modeling, and there is high-level modeling, which is what we are talking about. But I think all we do is modeling. Since can't we know that?
So I think this touches upon a point we touched upon repeatedly, whether data modeling is just another word for theory or for conceptualizing or having classes and concepts and ordering the world, or whether this is a specific subgenre, actually, sub-activity of this very general activity. We had, I think, different stances to this. So I'm really eager to hear your input on this, Harold.
I think that said, one should always keep in mind that we may be different. So think about how we represent movements in the brain are not syntactic necessarily, right? There can be something which is, something highly dynamic, four-dimensional or whatever, can probably not be modeled the way we think of models. Right? So it may be a model, but it's something which is not congruent. It's not, like Point Career says, it would be great if there would be a dictionary for geometry, so you can translate one into the other. Right? But it's not necessary that that exists, right? So we don't really know if that exists. So we should also always keep in mind that our models are always incomplete. And that's the interesting part, because we can do something new, a new model, if we find out that the old one actually has a new completion, which we now understand.
Actually, the fact that there are things out there which are not compatible for my model isn't an argument for the incompleteness for my model, because there are many facts out there which have nothing to do with my model. Because if I model persons and there is a stone out there, good for the stone. But, so movements and modeling text doesn't really touch on each other.
That's what I meant, right? So basically, if we say everything is a model, right? But definitely most of the world is probably out of scope of any model.
Can I intercede here and just say, this is really an agenda setting exercise, so I think identifying topics for thought is very important. Trying to work out the details of how that thought will go may be something that we would save for a later discussion.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we refer to real world in an academic humanities context, we mean the non-academic, non-humanities part of it. I'm wondering where that is. The politics, the strategy, the social context of modeling. There are models of persons that don't come from humanities that may be of interest or of use. Book digitization is not really, at the scale of tens of millions, is not driven by academic humanities. Wikipedia is a big player in linked data, let's say. So where is all of that?
Yeah, politics often, and that's a good point. I was hoping we could leave politics out, but you're right, we have to include it. It's very important.
Going back to what Steve Ramsey was saying yesterday, his comment about there are verb people and noun people. You can't have one without the other. And I think
No, there are people who verb and people who noun. There are people who verb and people who noun.
Right. But to have a subject and a verb and an object, if you want to think in those terms, then maybe let's define some verbs or set out what are the verbs that we're interested in, what are the nouns that go each side, and what are condition, what is one state of affairs at one side of the verb, and what is the state of affairs at the other side of the verb, right? So you have, wolf eats sheep. We know what a wolf is. We know whether the act of eating has successfully taken place or not, because there's a defined state of affairs at the end where the sheep is gone. It would be nice to have to know what an object at one side was, and what the verb was, and whether that verb had successfully happened or not, by saying what it is we expect at the other side. And I'm literally not trying to define all of these things, but to have some sense of what they are. And to just say that there's nouns and there's verbs, what are they that are important to us?
Yes, I'm trying to understand it. Is it an argument for that we have to have clear definitions on when a model is a good model, and or is this too general?
It's one step further, more concrete than that. It's you're modeling. What do you model? Okay, you're modeling something that involves a verb, but if it involves a verb, there must also be nouns associated with that verb. So what are they? So if it's and it could be transcription.
Yeah.
That could be your verb, transcribe. Well, okay, what's the state of affairs before transcribe? What's the state of affairs afterwards?
Can you tell me, I'm trying to take notes here, is this highlighted phrase at all getting at anything like what you mean? Or is it not being substituted of an equally pithy phrase that...
It's as good as I could.
All right.
Susan.
I was going to say something like pretty much, but I was also going to say something in response to your the idea theory. That could be a very interesting way of approaching it for people who are non-digital humanists. A way in that's like what we do in the rest of the humanities.
Okay. Yeah.
Where would you put that in, or what's
that would be helping people to understand.
Maybe under politics and strategy.
And helping people outside of the humanities.
Yeah,
understand
because
what
if you frame it within a theory-based paradigm, then in fact it's like what we understand, what we do already in the humanities,
it's
not
like
something different.
One of the tricks Elena was talking about.
Yes.
To taking
But I wanted to say about the pedagogy, competencies in pedagogy, maybe one of the things could be a framework for teaching data modeling, because you don't teach it the same way in all the different situations.
Yeah.
So if I have a master's that's a digital humanities master's, it would be maybe appropriate to have a whole course or a module. If I just have one course I'm teaching in an English department, it might be different. So what would it look like in different situations possibly?
And
So a
maybe-
kind of framework for that.
And maybe that would be an interesting aspect too, to define, if you have just 15 minutes about talking about data modeling, what are you talking about in this 15 minutes compared to the models?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic idea. And I would say that in terms of pedagogy, that's one thing that I think abstractly in literature, we teach knowledge organization all the time, right? You know, Aristotle, Francis Bacon, I mean, we're always talking about these concepts. And so in that sense, it's very easy, I think, for me and people like me to make that bridge. What I think is less intuitive are practical applications for, okay, now that we see that this is an ancient problem, and that we see that people are working on this problem in a new context, how can our students have access to that? And one idea that I had was, what if there were project-specific pedagogical tools or exercises or idea starters, what have you? So for example, the Women Writers Project has something, you know, that, okay, if I'm teaching Afro-Ben, and I would love to show some data from this project, what should my students know about the structure of this data? And you know, how can I introduce them to that without getting into all of the specifics of market that I might not have time for in my class? So I think that would be something that would be extremely useful and concrete for people to make use of.
I think we just have to make markup a prerequisite.
Of course.
I was thinking that I think it may relate to both politics and strategy, and also to pedagogy. I can't remember what the other category things are, but the word performative has come up several times. Maybe it's performative, maybe it's rhetoric, maybe it's narrative, but it applies both to thinking about doing modeling. So that's where the politics and strategy may come out. And it applies to actually doing modeling, which may be where the competencies of pedagogy applies. But I think the performative aspect of it is a way of thinking about how you do it, modeling and why you do modeling. So that may be another way of phrasing things that have already been said.
Yeah. More. Yes.
I think when we're developing a data model, we're developing a data structure, and that data structure must correspond to functions on a one-to-one mapping. If we declare there is a certain element that we want to do something with that element, if we want to interoperate with it, we want to make a very clear one-to-one mapping. We want to make, if we can declare something to be a data structure, then we need to have an intention of actually implementing it in some way. And what interoperability means is that this mapping is declared and has been agreed, and there's some kind of testing procedure that can verify that all the documents conforming to this data model can be processed in a particular piece of software which conforms to that. That's where interoperability is very strict. Something like SVG, for example, is a format which conforms to that. There are various programs that read SVG, you put the file in, it just works. I think we need to work towards something like that, not necessarily every single subjective tag or anything, but we need to have some kind of interoperable format that we can load and reuse.
In digital humanities in general, or do you think a format for specific areas or for specific mediums and medias?
You mean more general?
Yeah, I mean you could say I have such a format for texts between 1800 and 1900, or you could say I have this for text in general.
I don't think it should be at that level. I think that's already subjective, but as soon as you have different kinds of documents, even in one period, you have vast arrays of different kinds of tags that you want to use. So if you want to make it interoperable, you have to kind of take that subjective judgment out of it and interoperate with the technology
In the same way that XML, in fact, is a platform for it's interoperable, isn't it? I mean, there's a total standard, it conforms to that standard. Lots of programs can read XML. It is interoperable in itself. And the problem is that if one defines tags within XML, then there's a problem about getting interoperability unless you perform these very strict kind of controls, which I don't think we're prepared to do anyway.
Yeah.
But as I was saying before, if you just remove the tags from the text, you can interoperate with the text because it's Unicode text. The tags can be interoperated with at the level of the technology. You can process tags in various ways, similar to the way you kind of do it now. But that would increase the amount of interoperation that's happening in the various components of the system, rather than kind of merging it all together and confusing the issue and making it harder to build interoperability in. Is that clearer? No.
Yeah, I think this comes together with the whole topic of standardization and how we, at the one what Elena was talking about, is the tension between expressing something in a way which makes it interoperable, and the other way, seeing individual features in an artifact which you want to express, and very often the tension makes it impossible to do one or the other. And most humanists tend to go for the direction of expressing themselves or the artifact. And while we have, obviously, for many reasons to go in the other direction to make things more interoperable, and I think that
they just change the format, and you can liberate the interoperability problem.
Yeah,
that's all I'm suggesting.
I was a little hard to hear. Is this roughly at all what you're getting at, or have I missed it?
here let's see.
Sorry. I feel like I
spoke
missed
about
it.
More generalizable techniques.
No? Susan?
I'll write a sentence, sorry.
The so what question? The so what? Like, under politics and strategy, like, so what? Why should we care? We've been managing to do it kind of leveling along where people not in digital humanities don't even, maybe aren't aware of it.
Yeah.
Why should they care? Why should people care about this?
Okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, really.
Yeah, true. But actually, at the moment, we are in a good position. At least in Germany, we all the time, the other discussion, the humanities people come to us and say, people care so much about you. What can I do to be one of you? It's
right. Well, that's the problem that comes down to.
yeah. Just give it a few years, then it will change.
They might care about digital humanities,
yeah.
but not data modeling.
Yeah. But it very often implies the standards.
I think there's another in-between thing which is often left out, right? So if you look at the practice of projects, there's digital data modeling is more often on the agenda than, say, the workflow, so the extended data modeling, like workflow planning, or like how to implement the model in the user interface, how to set up the queries in order to access the model in the right way, and all that stuff, right? So from the project I've worked in over 15 years, that's basically the thing where I was like, yeah, we do all that, but nobody writes it down, nobody evaluates it, nobody is really interested in it. But it's something, like a lot of you guys work with Scrum, for example, right? That's something regular people in the humanities don't even have heard about, right? Even though this is so essential for your day-to-day life, right? So that's something which would be interesting, that these kind of workflows should also be at least taught in a way that people know they exist and how they work and what kind of productivity they bring, because they're very different from going to library, reading a book, and writing an article, right?
So I think there's a tension actually between two different approaches here. One being data modeling is a very concrete process of ability and knowledge, and on the other hand to say, actually you can learn this by yourself. You have to have the basic concepts and the grounding concepts. And obviously, in practice, we are going to move from one to the other, back and forth. But in my experience, it helps to have a more abstract approach. But I always stayed at the university, so probably I'm the last person to ask.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I I don't want to contradict that, as if I do. I mean, the thing is that at the same time, I think that one of the points that we make, and actually this does address Susan's question also, is that people are already doing data modeling. They don't necessarily call it data modeling. They don't necessarily have formal methods in this even, or maybe they do, and they don't even know that they're formal methods, right? That there's this, and this goes also to Carrie's point about knowledge organization, where these, data modeling is something that is a label that we're using to describe an activity, which is part of what we do, but it's also part of what other people are doing, and part of what humanities have done for a very long time without computers. I think we can accept that there are these blurry boundaries where it's not a situation where something is data modeling because you call it data modeling. On the contrary, this is actually an activity which we're labeling, and people are also doing that without that label. And to understand the actual activity itself is to make the links that address the questions about the relevance and the nature of the activity and how it comes to other things.
I would just kind of support that by saying I think Susan's question points to the problem of translatability in terms of data modeling. The digital humanities, I think, is hard enough for people to get a hold onto and understand what that might mean. Data modeling, I get the face, the glass-eyed stare, the fear. And I think that if we could think about ways to make all of these processes, which, and cultural practices about knowledge making more tangible for people, I think it would be so useful. A few years ago, Wordle, do you guys remember that thing? That was so enormously helpful. As a kind of snapshot. Oh, here I can dump in a text and get an immediate visual representation of, the way that text, one way that text is organized. And people could really grasp onto that in a way that was so helpful and useful. And I think that it would be great if we could think of more tangible examples of that kind of thing. Because I think there is a real big gap.
Just sort of observing this sort of tension in the last couple of moments, between the relationship of data modeling to our sort of projects and workflows and getting things done and sort of getting those practical applications underway, and this other tension of wanting to use data modeling to say something true that advances the sort of intellectual discourse in a particular way, which I think is coming out of some of the things that you've said and that Paul has said, and that figuring out a way to reconcile those two things seems to be a sort of important bit of work to do. I'll just work in the Google Doc.
One thought which I would like to discuss with you is the idea that in the very beginning we started to talk about whether there is anything specific to data modeling in the humanities. And one idea after 2 days of discussion could be, which is not a great idea, I have to admit, is it's the content, but it's more specifically, obviously we are working on basic concepts of the humanities all the time, like book, like text, like transcription, and we are analyzing them to make them more formally tractable. And this is a collaborative work going on for some time now, and this could be one of the central assets actually of data modeling in the humanities. Something like the whole reflection on the Ferber model and its way how to translate it in the digital world, things like Patrick's thoughts about transcription and so on. Do you think this would work? Does this sound in any way sensible, or is it just a snapshot from the last days? And how do you think the work of data modeling is really relating and changing your attitude towards the central concepts of your work? Most of you are coming from a humanist background, or many of you, so becoming digital has been something in your life. So did it change the attitude to these concepts, basic concepts?
I think the answer is definitely yes. But that's not only in the humanities. So what is it about going digital, as it were, that makes this change. Well, it's you have to become explicit about things. So making things more explicit will change things. Yeah? Also in other processes or other areas of daily experience. Yeah? So yes.
So it comes down to, because we never had to describe things more explicitly, in contrast to natural sciences, we now do have, and then so it changes us more than other fields of studies.
I think that's true, but my first answer was Gertrude Stein's answer when she was asked, have Americans changed? And her answer was, how could they change? They're only more like they were already.
Okay.
And I think the point actually speaks to this also, because making more explicit is also coming to consciousness, right? It's meaning that we're noticing and admitting something and owning something that was already there implicitly.
Absolutely.
And so, in that respect, it's one of the interesting things about this is, and we've talked about this also in the last couple of days, is that part of what's interesting about modeling is the way in which it forces us to come to terms with the residuum, right, with the part that isn't in the model, which is always interesting to the humanities, right? I mean, this is why Frankenstein is that word text, because it's somehow that by creating something we also exile something, and therefore then we have to come to terms with what the consequence of that is. And I think that's actually something that's really very important and very momentous about what's happening now with digital technologies in the humanities, because the humanities, in some ways, we've sort of been coasting. For example, in the States, we talk about the two cultures problem and how the humanities are over here and scientists are over there, and now we can't really get away with that any longer. And that's actually a real great opportunity.
I was just going to quickly directly respond to you, sort of saying, how has data modeling changed your work? I'm glad you added a bit about, for those of you who come from humanities, I'm thinking, data modeling is my work. What do you mean? With that geek mind on a little bit, one thing that might be on our agenda, that may be there already, I haven't read the whole thing, is how do our models affect our ability to do the processing, or in particular meta models? How much we have to actually worry about having modeling systems that our processors can handle in overnight or less kind of stuff, that kind of problem. We only have limited resources. Do the modeling systems we choose affect that, or are we in such a utopian computing universe that we just don't care?
I think the changes go deeper, at least for me, for example. My whole view on language has changed, for example, since I use Corpora, and that has to do with going digital too. And I think something else has changed too. The concept of text has changed, at least text as we produce it now. So perhaps there's a difference between the texts which have been produced before and the text we produce now, because that's much more a process where you can actually, I don't know, put one bit from here to another bit, and in a much more flexible way than this was perhaps possible when you did handwriting. But it would be nice to reflect about it, I think, actually.
Thomas.
I think this kind of two cultures thing is a very interesting thing, because it's also a data model that if you look at like disciplines and how they're dissected, right? And it's everybody says you can't get away with like separating natural sciences from humanities. If you look at the code download statistics, actually you can't get away with it to do both, because people will just not fund it, right? And because you're in between these things, which are really disconnected, which is really, really bad. And I think what data models can do in that kind of situation is you can actually put the model on a piece of paper. It's not somebody says, yeah, humanities are like this and that, and we have something which we can put on the table to collectively think and discuss about. And then we can put the data in, and then we can say, your picture is really disconnected, but if you look closely, there's a lot of connections, and maybe it makes sense to this kind of Palestine line So you can get back and forth from physics to art history and back, right? Because it makes sense. And I think that's the interesting part of it, that we can use these data models to actually see, okay, where are the bad parts of it, how does the data reflect that? And I think it's always this back and forth. You cannot do data models without looking at the data, and you cannot work with data without having a model, right?
Just to echo some of that, one of the things that really helps with collaboration, of course, is having a shared vocabulary and shared research questions. But one of the things that we're talking about here is what do you do when, in fact, the data models are sometimes isolating you from those that you could, in fact, be collaborating with. So being explicit, analyzing data models in ways that help expose some of the implicit assumptions that are built in, moving at that meta level can actually help get the work done on the ground.
Actually, what you asked what is specific about humanities data modeling, I was going to say allowing for contradiction, semantic disruption, ambiguity, these kind of things. But then when you brought up the two cultures, I was thinking again, and probably this is not specific for humanities, because I share this kind of need with quantum physicists, for instance, much more than with quantitative linguists. So actually I think the divide is not humanities versus the rest of the world, it's interpretation against measuring or these kind of oppositions. So maybe the very term digital humanities is a useful term in terms of branding. It is not very useful in terms of explaining what we're actually doing and what we do in data modeling.
Aspect. Do you think that data modeling of digital humanities is basically just a collection of different activities which have nothing really to do with each other, more with each other than with other activities? So we are just constructing something. So that was where you're.
Just to build on Stefan's statement about some of those values that he was expressing that have come up in a number of the presentations. So Stefan's point that we want RDF triples that can do more than express citations, that they can also express affective information or statements, contradictory markup, and so forth. This relates to the question of what might be of interest in humanities data modeling that might be of interest to others. So your point about physicists might actually be interested in these things. I've been trying to wrap my head around how much of these values have actually been realized in some of the models and ontologies, and how much of it is still aspirational. So I think for Stefan, in terms of the RDF triples, it is largely still aspirational. But I think in terms of the contradictory markup, that the community has made some headway. So I think actually taking the time to highlight some of the ways in which we've actually made progress on tools or models or ontologies that actually do try to instantiate those values would be really useful in that advocacy and outreach component.
Yeah. So, I would like to contradict you actually, because saying that what we're doing as digital humanities people is basic, the data modeling especially has nothing more in common than data modeling and others. I think when we talk about the last day, may show that there are many commonalities, especially because the objects we are talking about, they have these commonalities. And Alan was trying to point to this by maybe using this somehow misleading concept of intentionality, but we all understand, I think, now what he meant by that. And this really is a difference. It makes a difference to talking about stones or particles at an atomic level. So I think there is a point in looking at that and seeing that there's a group of activities which is somehow more closely related than all activities of data modeling.
Actually, I would like to support this view that I think you mentioned the text. So the text is something very specific to the humanities. This doesn't mean that we maybe apply methods from the statistics, for instance, which we share with the natural sciences and physicists. But there is a specific object in the humanities which is text in a very broad sense. And our tools are related to that text and characterize the models we create for describing this text. Maybe the very term data is problematic in here, because as a humanities, I wouldn't speak about data, but rather documents, maybe text, books, whatever. But data is no key term for my profession. And so this is a bit ambiguous. There are data, of course, but it's not a key term of my profession.
I think I can understand that, given the current state of machine learning as a concept and its proponents. But I very much have the opinion that archaeologists, epigraphers who work with objects, people who work in museums, art historians, who work with visual things, historians of music, and so we not only use text as an argument, right? It's always with images in the background. And if you look at like how complexity studies today, actually there is not only the text as an argument. Hardcore physicists would basically give conferences where you only have differential equations, and then there's people using plots and there's people using visualizations. And I think the central kind of thing, both the way of communicating both kinds of subject, can be something which is totally not textbook. Even if
may I contradict with that? I think the very product of your research is a text. It's not an image. So as an art historian, you don't create an image as the result of your research, but you create a text with maybe illustrations. And the physicist, maybe
I think it's good to remember what Julia said before. I think we now know
that this is
problem.
clearly an issue that needs to be addressed.
Right.
It's expressive as a question.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Maybe another aspect in the area of discipline specificity, it seems to me, okay, we put modeling contradictions, ambiguity, indeterminacy, and things like that. That's true, but it all sounds a bit negative. Right? So what is it really? Isn't it also about diversity, that we want diversity and we want to model, represent the diversity also in the models. We want to represent our different opinions on a text or our different models, other kinds of models on text or on some other artifact. And I think that's very distinctive.
You're reminding me of the, I think it's Hitchhiker's Guide. We demand rigidly defined areas of uncertainty and doubt.
You're just.
I was rejecting, that's fine.
It's fine.
It's fine.
It's fine. Any more input? We just finish it in time. So thanks for your lively discussion again.
Yeah, and this has been extremely valuable, I think, and this is a good artifact for us to use in the report and white paper, and also as a possible next step.
Thanks.
And thanks to anonymous users 46 and 195 who are So we have our coffee break, and then we will reconvene for the next session.